Welcome, everyone, to Lunch with the Idaho Way. I'm Scott McIntosh, opinion editor of the Idaho Statesman.
And I'm Bryan Clark, Idaho Statesman opinion writer.
This week, we are talking about a bill that's making its way through the legislature that would criminalize gender-affirming care for transgender youth.
Yeah, this is House Bill 71, which was sponsored by Representative Bruce Skog, Nampa Republican. It would ban all gender-affirming care for minors. That includes surgery, but it also includes things like hormone therapy and puberty blockers that are less invasive and in some cases considered reversible. It would make, for either parents or doctors who participated in this, there could be a punishment of up to 10 years in prison. It passed the House on a near party line vote, 58-12.
Yeah, the only Republican to vote against the bill was Representative Matthew Bundy of Mountain Home. He did not debate the bill on the floor, but there was one Republican, Representative Lori McCann of Lewiston, who debated the bill on the House floor, and she gave really compelling, empathetic testimony against the bill. She had met with parents of transgender children, and she met with a 16-year-old transgender student. And she even told her fellow legislators that she has a member of her own family who is transgender. And yet, despite all of that, she voted in favor of the bill. She said that she supported the ban on surgeries for transgender youth under 18, but she did not support the other parts of the bill, the gender-affirming care, the puberty blockers, and the hormone therapy. She said that would be devastating to the folks that she talked to, the parents and the student that she talked to. And nonetheless, she still voted for the bill in favor of it. I sat down and spoke with Eve Devitt. She's a 17-year-old Boise High junior who testified in committee against the bill. She's a transgender girl, and I sat down with her and her father, Michael Devitt, and we talked about their experience, what their experience has been like over the past few years, and what this bill would mean to them personally. Here's my interview with Michael and Eve Devitt.
I mean, when Eve first told us that she was transgender, my first response was, no, no, you're not. And, I think that's probably pretty normal. But I was very resistant, thinking, oh, somebody's trying to influence her online to do this. There's no way, it's impossible. And then I did this really crazy thing. I actually listened to her. And when I did that, I realized this is who Eve has been all along. And we all knew that Eve was very unique at a very young age, but didn't know what that meant. And when I stepped back, I realized, oh, that's exactly what it means. Sure, that makes total sense. But I was not, Mr. Father of the Year type of thing at all. And it took me probably a year to come around.
And how old were you at that time?
13 or
13? Yeah, 13.
Yeah.
13.
And what was your experience like? What was it like growing up?
That's such a hard question because I don't have anything to compare it to, I've never lived any other life.
Because I've read people say, I didn't know what it was. I just didn't feel right.
Yeah. No, I definitely.
And I read somebody had said that, I didn't think I was a girl. I just kind of knew that there was something wrong. So what was your experience up until then?
So, when from the earliest I can remember, which is about 2 years old or so, I always identified so much more with my mom and my sister than my dad. And I would look to my sister and my mom to see who I was supposed to be, right? And so then by the time that preschool rolled around, right, that I'm sure that I was told that I was a boy before that, right? But that was the first time where it really meant something. It didn't mean anything to me, but it meant something to other people, to see me as that. And so I went along with it because it didn't matter because there's no difference at that age, right? There's absolutely no difference. And so then by the time I was in third grade, I started to feel really alienated because of this identity that was put on me. And I knew that Like, I remember telling friends, like, in 3rd grade that I was a girl. But I didn't know what that meant for me or for them or for anybody, right? I just knew that that was the truth, right? But I didn't have a word for that until, like, probably the next year. In 4th grade is when I finally learned, hey, that's what I am, you know? I am transgender, right?
Okay, and then kind of leading up to this when you were 12, 13 years old, telling your dad, what was that whole experience like?
Well, I had told my mom first in our family, and then my sister found out somehow. I don't know. It was super low key, and it was pretty nice because I didn't have to do anything or say anything. Right? I don't remember exactly how it went down for my dad, but I remember it being like almost more low key than it was with my sister when I like actually told him, which I think is really interesting.
I probably
Because-
hid what I probably.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah,
For sure.
Eve probably didn't see my responses. I think I dealt more with my wife on that one. And ironically, we had a very close family that we were friends with in Nampa, who also, they had a transgender son, a little older than Eve, more the age of our eldest daughter.
Yeah.
That were going through the same thing at the same time. And so that was kind of interesting because the mother was having a hard time with that. I was having a hard time with Eve. So we would sort of commiserate to the benefit of no one. And, eventually we both kind of realized this is what it is. We're the ones with the problem and moved on. But so Eve probably didn't see any of that, which is probably for the best.
But there was a transition where there was kind of like, I don't know, like a wait and see as you were thinking?
Kind of, yeah. No, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, and that lasted probably about 2 months. And then I realized, oh, no, this is not.
And Eve, you were just getting worse and more despondent?
Yeah, pretty much.
And suicidal?
Yeah, definitely.
Just because of, and I don't know, maybe help explain to us?
Well, explain why I was feeling them or what I was feeling.
Yeah, what you were feeling.
I mean, I think you pretty much nailed the head there. I just felt more isolated, even from people who I was like out with, and I was definitely like, if I went through like male puberty, I wouldn't be around right now. Like 100% I would not, because it was I don't know, I was like trapped, and I felt like there's no way to stop that.
Okay, so talk about kind of the specifics of this bill, that, and really the Idaho bill goes a lot further than, like Utah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Anything before it, really.
Yeah. Puberty blockers, hormones, surgery.
Mm-hmm.
So how would this affect you?
It would stop me from having access to any of that, which would be super, super detrimental and potentially put me back in that headspace that I was in, which is terrifying, like absolutely terrifying.
I mean, imagine if you're living your life finally at a place where you have found who you are, and somebody with no stake in the game, none, has nothing to do with you, has never met you. By the way, I sent 30 letters to senators and representatives over the summer offering to take them to breakfast with our family so that they could get to know us. Not one responded, not one. So imagine that being taken away by somebody who doesn't even care enough to spend 30 minutes with you.
Exactly. During the hearing, Representative Young was talking about how she has spent a day with a detransitioner, and that's changed how she views being trans or whatever. And I was like, have you ever spent a day with, a trans person? Like the people you're directly affecting with this bill? Have you ever done that?
That's really problematic.
Yeah,
and I
very
think
much
as
so.
a parent, just drawing myself out of this, from a political point of view, as a parent, what do you tell your kids? And our kids are super smart, but it's like, what do you tell them when We live within sight of the Capitol. When we're on our front porch, we see the Capitol. Yeah. So that building over there, for 4 months out of the year, there's going to be people from all around the state that are going to come here and try to devise ways to increase your suffering.
Yeah.
How do you do that as a parent? How do you explain that as a parent? Rather than this is the people's house where people's representatives come to do good things for people, it is all about creating suffering for people that they are uncomfortable
Absolutely.
with. And I can't for the life of me understand that, but it's hard as a parent because we can't protect her at all. We can do nothing except leave the state, which is our next option, quite honestly. So it upsets me. It really upsets me a lot.
It's so interesting because for the first 2 years of my transition, of people seeing me and treating me as a woman, I never heard anybody talk about trans anything, ever, for those 2 years. After that first set of bills in 2020, the first set of anti-trans bills, I can't go like a week without hearing something about trans people or whatever in the news, or, you know, it was never talked about, which, I mean, I think it's good that it's being talked about if it helps people figure out who they are, but it also puts targets on trans people's backs, you know, which really sucks, because I would love for just, you know, that prior part, you know, I would love for there to be more recognition for trans people that doesn't point to us as being like the most able to be subjugated legally class of people, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because that's really what it is. It's exactly what legislation and the legal system did with gay people in like the 80s and 90s, right? It's because we don't have protection, legal protection. And so they can, you know, exert their power over us legally, and there isn't much pushback.
The bill that Eve is concerned about is now over on the Senate side. It's been assigned to the Senate Judiciary Committee, and it's awaiting a possible hearing now.
Yeah, and Bryan, I know that this is kind of a frantic time in the legislature because they're trying to get bills introduced and get bills printed and kind of crazy. And this bill has sat over on the Senate side in committee, well, for maybe a week or so. I don't know if that's a sign that it's struggling, or you know, what's your sense on whether we're going to actually see this get a Senate hearing in the Senate?
I think it's very hard to say. The Senate historically has shown a little bit more reluctance to take up bills like this, but not a ton. And it moved further to the right with the last election. Because we're so close to the period of time where bills stop generally being introduced, new bills stop being introduced, and the Senate starts focusing on the House starts focusing on the Senate bills. It's at this point, I think, a little too early to say what the fate of this bill is. I wouldn't be surprised by either outcome.
Yeah. And this is part of a larger movement. This is, you know, not unique to Idaho. You know, Idaho follows Utah. Utah, very early in the session, I think the first week of the session, they passed a similar bill that banned surgeries. It also technically banned gender-affirming care like puberty blockers and hormone therapy, but it was you could still get that treatment if you were diagnosed with gender dysphoria. So the Utah bill doesn't quite go as far, but there are other bills across the country. I understand that there's one bill in another state that puts the age at 26. You can't have gender-affirming care before the age of 26. Another one before the age of 21. So now we're talking about adults. And there's kind of this larger movement. I know that the tip of the spear in Idaho is this Idaho Family Policy Center, but that's kind of part of a broader national network going on.
Yeah, it's been a major push among the far right, and specifically among the resurgent sort of Christian nationalist faction of the far right, which the Idaho Family Policy Center is a part of. On the national level, a lot of it's been led by a group called the Alliance Defending Freedom. It's been led by a lot of people. The current CEO is Michael Ferris, who for a long time headed the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. So this was an extremely conservative Christian group of homeschoolers who thought that secular curriculum was indoctrination. This is back in the 90s. They were making these arguments. They were the authors of the trans sports bill that made its way through several years ago, is now held up in the court. And this was a really interesting thing that you've noted. There's been this was not an issue that was discussed very much at all before about 2020. And then you had the sports bill. You had a bill saying that it was impossible to get birth certificates or other identifying documents that match your gender. Both of these are unconstitutional, likely, and they're being held up in court. But just year after year, that's been one of the primary pushes of the legislature, is just to push these people around.
Yeah, and Representative Bruce Skog didn't just wake up one morning and say, I've got to solve this problem of transgender people. He was handed a bill, just like Barbara Ehart was handed a bill, and to get sponsors. You and I kind of differ a little bit on the motivations for these legislators. I kind of feel like they're rubes and being duped. You kind of feel like more like they know exactly what they're doing, that they're scoring political points.
Yeah, I tend to think that they're playing to their base. My general thought is they perceive themselves quite correctly as beneficiaries of the culture war, and so to the degree they can attack the cultural enemies of the right wing using legislation, that's to their benefit, and that's their motivation in my view. I think it's rather heartless, but I think that's the motivation.
Yeah. So a viewer wonders what the chances are that Governor Little would veto this bill. And that's a really good question. I know we, as an editorial board, urge the governor, if he's in his last term as governor, he's 69 years old. He might not run for re-election. So he doesn't have to worry about a challenge from his far right next time around, because he won't be running for re-election. Perhaps, we don't know. So we said, you've got freedom to vote your conscience and veto your conscience. And so, what are the chances? I don't know. I'd probably give it a 50-50 chance at this point. I don't know if you think differently, Bryan.
Yeah, maybe 50-50. I wouldn't be too surprised by either outcome. He Little did not veto either of the two prior bills I mentioned, the sports ban or the ID ban. It was, if you go back and read his statements that he issued about not vetoing it, on the other hand, it was clear that he saw major problems with those pieces of legislation. Nonetheless, he didn't veto them. So that makes it very hard to predict what he'll do this time.
Yeah, now, of course, he didn't veto those, knowing that he was going to be running for re-election and probably was going to be facing a challenge from his right in the primary. So if he doesn't have that thought now, perhaps he'll veto it. And, it was interesting that there wasn't any sort of compromise. Representative Lori McCann, she did kind of hint at a compromise, that she was in favor of banning surgeries for anyone under 18. And I think the testimony was that there have not been any surgeries done in Idaho, so that, that would be perhaps acceptable. And I think Representative McCann even said that the folks that she talked to, they had not done surgery under 18, and they would be amenable to that. But the puberty blockers and the hormone therapy would just be devastating to them. And there was no discussion of any sort of compromise. And so I wonder if Governor Little could see a middle way out if it indeed gets a hearing in the Senate and passes the Senate. One thing I wanted to ask you, Bryan, and I don't know if you've got thoughts on this, and this was assigned to the House Judiciary and Rules Committee, not Health and Welfare. I don't know, is that unusual?
I wouldn't think so. It is a criminal statute. I wouldn't be too surprised by either one, but it's not really like a healthcare regulation like you would expect to see in House Health and Welfare. It is, it's saying if you pursue this type of medical care, we'll put you in prison for 10 years. So that's a much more serious thing, not typically something the health and welfare would deal with, though. It kind of depends on the bill, particularly this session. There are a lot of bills that you would expect to end up in Senate Education, for example, that have ended up elsewhere.
Yeah, that's interesting. And not that any of these legislators are particularly experts in the field, but this testimony and this bill did have a lot to do with medical testimony and medical information. And Representative McCann pointed out that Representative Skog on the floor of the House had stated some falsehoods, stated some misleading information in debating the bill. So it's interesting that it's in that committee and not Health and Welfare, but it's in Judiciary and Rules as well in the Senate. So we'll keep an eye on that. I want to thank everybody for joining us this week. We're going to be back next week. We're going to be talking about another interesting hot topic in the legislature, school vouchers, and we'll have another interview with an expert. In the meantime, please sign up for my free weekly email newsletter, The Idaho Way. The link is below in the comments. So thank you again, and we will see you next week.
Thanks.